Hi everybody, this is Sage and I'm here with Zach to present the Your Choice readings for week 2. Today I'll talk about the theories of the policy cycle. Zach will talk about advice and consent, the development of the policy sciences. And Zach will also talk about big data in the policy cycle, policy decision making in the digital era. I'll provide a little bit of a wrap up and then we'll present the reading questions for this week. So the first reading is Theories of the Policy Cycle by Jan Wegrich. This reading will give an overview of the stages of the policy process, which you see below, a critique of the cycle framework, and it'll also assess the limitations and utility of the policy cycle. The cyclical perspective emphasizes feedback and processes between outputs and inputs of policymaking, leading to the continual perpetuation of the policy process. So they're presented as if they're in an order, but really it's cyclical and they all affect one another. So the first stage that's talked about in the reading is agenda setting. This is also known as problem recognition and issue selection. And it happens when a social problem has been defined as such and the necessity of state of intervention has been expressed. So this is a process of structuring the policy issue regarding potential strategies and instruments that shape the development of a policy in the subsequent stages of the cycle. This stage moves from an issue from the recognition stage, recognition of a problem, to the formal political agenda. And there are several patterns, the first of which is outside initiation. This is when social actors force governments to place an issue on the systemic agenda by way of gaining public support. Conversely, inside initiation pattern happens when interest groups have direct access to government agencies and are capable of putting topics on the agenda without major interference or sometimes without even the knowledge of the public. Another pattern is mobilization, which is the mobilization of support within the public by the government after something is set to the initial agenda. And finally, consolidation is when state actors initiate an issue where public support is already high. Another theory in agenda setting is Kingdon's multiple streams model. This is when a policy window opens when 3 separate and independent streams, the policy stream, the politics stream, and the problem stream all intersect. The next stage is policy formulation and decision making. This is when expressed problems, proposals, and demands are transformed into government programs. This stage of the cycle is really theory heavy, and studies have been influenced by efforts to improve practices within governments by introducing techniques and tools for more rational decision making by governments. Decision making comprises not only of information gathering and processing, but of conflict resolution within and between public and private actors and government departments. Typically, this leads to a process of reactive policymaking rather than proactive policymaking. Governments and civil servants are not separated from wider society when formulating policies. And although the final decision on specific policies is in the hands of institutions and governments, it's preceded by a process of formulation with all sorts of actors, such as interest groups, departments, or the general public. And a lot of studies have argued that these early preliminary stages of the decision-making process have a major influence on the final outcome of the policy. Policy formulation proceeds as a complex social process in which state actors play an important but not necessarily decisive role. Next stage in the reading is implementation, and this is the stage of execution or enforcement of a policy by the responsible institutors or organizations that are often part of the public sector. Ideally, implementation consists of the specification of program details, the allocation of resources, and then the decision making. Hargrove theorized that implementation was the missing link because before, the study of policymaking really didn't look at what happens after a bill becomes law. It sort of ended once government passed a law. The aftermath was not really perceived as the central problem. But now implementation has become the central field of policy research. Early studies of implementation had a hierarchical top-down approach, so they looked sort of more at how government officials and administrators implemented a policy. But more recently, this perspective has been challenged. The bottom-up perspective of implementation centralizes the role of agencies and personnel and the people on the ground really doing the work in shaping the actual outcome of the policy. This perspective also considers the diverse demands of different policies and views policy as an output of the implementation rather than the input. So it's really looking more at the consequences of a policy than it is the policy when it's first on the agenda before it's been implemented. Implementation research shifted the focus to the context of policies in wider society rather than focusing on improving internal administrative and government capacities. The next two stages presented in the reading are evaluation and termination. Normative rationale is that policymaking should be appraised against intended objectives and impacts. The studies focus on intended results and unintended consequences of policies as a measure for how effective a policy is. There are a few issues with evaluation, mostly based in partisan politics. The first is that assessment is biased depending on the interests and values of the evaluator. And the second is that to avoid blame, governments often avoid precisely defining the goals of a policy, which makes it difficult to measure the outcomes against the intended consequences and the intended goals. Evaluations can lead to a couple of different patterns of policy learning. The first is that successful policies will be reinforced. For example, pilot programs that usually last for a limited time or in a limited space maybe are enacted, and then if they're successful, then the policy is adopted on a wider scale. The other pattern is that evaluation can lead to the termination of a policy. Termination of policies is pretty rare, and it can be difficult to enforce unless there's a specific opportunity or large-scale budget cuts or something like that. Policies and programs tend to live on even when they've outlived their usefulness. Politicians just have greater incentives for creating new programs rather than terminating old ones. So the government tends to be really oversaturated with programs because the short-term political and financial costs of termination of a program usually outweighs the long-term benefits. So generally, critiques of the policy cycle state that the stages of the policy cycle can be disjointed. It's sort of differentiated into these separate stages and doesn't The argument is that the stages don't accurately describe the policy process because they all affect one another. Additionally, a lot of research really focuses on one stage or another, and sort of each stage holds its own theoretical framework rather than the policy process making up a single theoretical framework. So they can be really disconnected from one another. And like I said earlier, they're sort of presented as a cycle or like there's some sort of order when really each stage affects all other stages. The policy cycle, again, is based on a top-down perspective, looking more at governments and administrators than the public at large. Other critiques say that the cycle ignores elements of the policy process that are not based in problem solving. So any nuance is sort of lost. It says that it can ignore the role of knowledge, ideas, and learning as variables in each stage of the policy process. And overall, the critiques really say that the cycle is oversimplified and unrealistic and makes policy making seem a lot more straightforward than it really is. The policy cycle has provided a lot of useful tools for evaluating policy making and is seen as an important conceptual framework. Even though it can be really disjointed, it is essential as a basic template for comparing contributions to the field of policy studies. It really serves as a baseline for communication between diverse approaches in the field. Many central research questions still derive from this framework. It just sort of serves as a baseline because otherwise there's not a lot of structure to policy making because of its complexity. Finally, the policy cycle highlights which actors are the most important or dominant in defining a policy problem or formally adopting a particular policy.